Alright, so the basic concept with a camera is to control the light to make a proper exposure. An exposure is capturing light to take a picture. Obviously, with any camera, the light is going to enter the camera through the lens, so the light is coming in this direction. Once the light comes into the camera, it's the photographer's job to control that light, how much or how little you want, to make a proper exposure. And these cameras are manual cameras, they don't have automatic settings. So you need to understand the components of a camera in order to control that light. The two parts of the camera that we're going to talk about here are your aperture and your shutter speed. Those two components work together to help control the light to come into the camera to make proper exposures. The first part of the camera is the aperture. The aperture is located here. It's this ring located along the back of the lens. Basically, the aperture is the opening of the lens. So it kind of works the same way as a human eye. The iris of the eye will open up in less light conditions. It will open up in order for you to see better. Or if you walk out into the sun, your iris will close up so you're not blinded by the light. Your eyes adjust to the light, just like a camera can adjust light. But again, this is in a manual mode, so you have to do the adjusting. But this is your aperture. You'll notice you're going to see a series of numbers on the aperture, starting at 3.5 and then all the way up to 22. Those numbers determine the size of the aperture, the size of the lens opening. That would probably make sense that a larger number would be a larger opening and a smaller number would be a smaller opening, but actually it works the opposite way. And the reason for that is because these numbers represent fractions. So if you think of it in terms of fractions of a whole number, say 8 or an eighth of a whole number is a larger section than, say, a 16th or a 22nd of a whole number. So the larger the number, the smaller the opening, or the less amount of light that's coming through. The smaller the number, the larger the opening of the lens, or the more light that's coming through. We'll come back to apertures in a moment. The other part of the camera that we're going to talk about is called the shutter speed, and that's located up here. This is your shutter speed dial. Again, a series of numbers indicates what your speed is. Basically, what a shutter speed controls is how much time the light has to hit the film. The aperture is the amount of light coming into the camera, and the shutter speed then controls the amount of time that light has to actually hit the film and make an exposure. Again, we're working in fractions of a second. Starting at 1, that is a full second. So if we had our shutter speed set for 1, that means the shutter would stay open for a full second. In terms of photography, a full second is an eternity. And there would be I would assume you'd never need an opportunity where you'd use a shutter speed of a second. But as we start to climb, as we start to increase these numbers, we're decreasing the amount of time, because again, we're talking about fractions of a second. So if 1 was a second, 8 is an eighth of a second. 30 is a 30th of a second, and so on, all the way up to a 2,000th of a second. So a lot of differences in the amount of time that you allow the light to hit the film. Why do you need all the differences? Again, depending on the light situation, depending on the light source. If you're indoors in a room maybe with very dim light, you would want more light to hit the film for a longer period of time. A longer period of time might be a 30th or a 15th of a second. If you walk outside on a nice bright sunny day, you have a lot of light, you need less light, less amount of time for the light to hit the film. You might increase your shutter speed to say 2/50th of a second. So just depending on your lighting situation. Now, we're going to open up the camera briefly just to physically demonstrate how these two components work. So let's remove the lens from the camera. First, we're going to look at the aperture. As you can see, you can look right through the lens of the camera. This is obviously looking at the back of the lens. According to the dial, our aperture is currently opened 3.5, and as we said before, 3.5 is a large opening. In fact, it's the largest aperture that's listed on this lens. The smallest aperture would be 22, but we're open to 3.5. So what we're going to do is, as you look through that camera, we're going to start to close that aperture. And what you're going to find is the little window inside this lens is going to start to close up. So now we're at aperture f5.6, 8, 11, 16, and 22. So as you can see, that opening is decreasing, allowing less and less light to enter into the camera. So again, 22 versus 3.5. So depending on the lighting situation, it will depend on how much or how little amount of light you want to let into the camera. Now, let's go look at the shutter speed. The shutter speed, or the shutter, I should say, the shutter door, is located here in the back of the camera. It's currently closed. So if this camera was closed up, if it had film in it, it was closed up, the film would not be exposed to any light. Even though light would be coming through the lens, the light actually hits this mirror, and it doesn't actually expose the film yet. The only way the light's going to expose the film is if the shutter door opens. So I'm going to turn the shutter to a manual setting. Sorry. This B is a manual setting, and that's going to allow me to open the shutter for as long as I want. So just for this demonstration purpose, I'm going to put it on B. So when I hit the shutter release button, the shutter is now open. So light is coming all the way through the camera, and it would be affecting the film. So now it closes. Again, open and close. So that's how the shutter will open and allow light to hit the film. If we use a standard shutter speed of, say, let's say a 1/15 of a second, 1/15 of a second in relative time, it's a short amount of time, but in terms of photography, it's a long period of time. So let's watch and see how the shutter speed opens at a 1/15 of a second. It opens and closes pretty quickly, but you can physically see the door open and close. We'll do it one more time. 1/15 of a second, opening and closing. That 1/15 of a second is allowing light to pass all the way through the camera and hit the film. Now, let's change our shutter speed to something a little faster, say 2/50 of a second. Okay, we'll do it one more time. Okay, in that case, we can barely see the shutter door open and close. You might be able to see a little bit of light coming through, but it's obviously moving at a much quicker pace. So again, there's less amount of time for the light to pass through the camera and onto the film. So depending on the lighting situation. So there's just a very brief overview of the aperture of the lens, and the shutter speed and how they work together. Again, the aperture is the amount of light coming through the lens and into the camera, and then the shutter speed is the amount of time that light has to actually hit the film and make an exposure.